The Idaho Murders, the case that refused to end cold, opened July 2025, was supposed to bring an end to one of the most closely watched murder cases in modern American history. After years of investigation, pretrial hearings, and mounting public attention, Bryan Kohberger stood in an Idaho courtroom and admitted responsibility for the murders of 4 University of Idaho students. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he accepted 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. For many observers, that guilty plea appeared to close the chapter on a tragedy that had gripped the nation since November 2022. But just over a year later, the story took another unexpected legal turn. In 2026, Kohberger filed a petition seeking to challenge the guilty plea that had spared him from a capital trial. He claimed his plea had not been voluntary and alleged constitutional violations, including ineffective assistance of counsel. A court appointed new attorneys to represent him during the post-conviction proceedings, but that appointment did not mean his claims had been accepted. Under Idaho law, overturning a guilty plea after sentencing requires proving a manifest injustice, one of the highest legal standards in criminal law. As of August 2026, Kohberger remains convicted and incarcerated under 4 life sentences. No judge has ruled that his petition has merit, and no new trial has been ordered. Yet the filing revived a question that has lingered since the day the guilty plea was entered. Without a public trial, how much of the story do we actually know? Why were these 4 young people targeted? What evidence never reached open court? And how did investigators solve a case that, for weeks, seemed to have no obvious suspect? To answer those questions, we have to return to the quiet college town where everything began. Chapter 1. Moscow, Idaho. Long before the case became international news, Moscow was known for something entirely different. Located in northern Idaho, near the Washington state border, the city had a population of around 25,000 residents. During the academic year, thousands of students from the University of Idaho filled its streets, coffee shops, and neighborhoods. It was the kind of college town where students often walked home after late-night gatherings, without giving it much thought. Violent crime was relatively uncommon. Among the neighborhoods popular with students was an area surrounding King Road, where off-campus rental homes regularly hosted social gatherings and weekend parties. One of those homes sat at 1122 King Road. Unlike many traditional houses, the property had 3 levels built into a hillside. The layout placed bedrooms on different floors, with several separate entrances and exits, making the home appear larger and more complex than it looked from the street. By November 2022, 6 young women lived there. 2 of them would survive, 4 of them would not. The 4 students whose lives were taken came from different backgrounds, but their lives had become closely connected through the university. 21-year-old Kaylee Goncalves had grown up in Idaho and was preparing for a major transition. She was expected to graduate soon and had already accepted a job with a technology company in Texas. Family members later described her as ambitious, energetic, and excited about beginning a new chapter. Her longtime best friend, Madison Mogan, was also 21. The two had been inseparable for years, and friends often referred to them as being like sisters. Madison was studying marketing and was remembered for her warm personality and close relationships with friends and family. On another floor of the house lived Xana Kernodle, 20 years old, a marketing student, known for her outgoing nature and strong work ethic. Her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, also 20, attended the University of Idaho as a freshman. Ethan was one of 3 triplets, and those who knew him frequently described him as kind, optimistic, and deeply devoted to his family. The victims represented 4 very different lives, with different futures ahead of them. None of those futures would arrive. Saturday, November 12, 2022, looked ordinary. Like countless other weekends in Moscow, students gathered with friends, attended social events, and enjoyed the final hours before classes resumed. Investigators later reconstructed each victim's movements, using surveillance footage, digital records, and witness interviews. Bryan Kohberger, and Madison Mogen spent the evening in downtown Moscow, visiting local businesses before stopping at a late-night food truck. Video footage later released publicly showed the two friends waiting for food shortly after 1:40 a.m. They eventually accepted a ride home from a private driver who was not considered a suspect. Meanwhile, Xana Kernodle and Ethan Chapin attended a gathering at the Sigma Chi fraternity house. Sometime later that night, they also returned to the King Road residence. The two surviving roommates had spent their evening elsewhere before coming home as well. Nothing publicly known about that evening suggested the house was about to become the scene of one of Idaho's most devastating crimes. Inside, the residents gradually settled in for the night. Outside, someone was approaching. The hours before the attack. One reason investigators were able to reconstruct parts of that night was the enormous amount of digital information left behind. Security cameras from nearby homes captured passing vehicles. Cellular records documented movements that investigators later compared with surveillance footage. Digital activity from phones helped establish when several occupants were still awake. According to court filings, investigators believe the attack occurred sometime after 4 a.m. The exact sequence inside the house has never been presented at a public trial because Kohberger's guilty plea eliminated the need for prosecutors to lay out every detail before a jury. What is publicly known comes primarily from the probable cause affidavit, later court filings, and evidence disclosed during pretrial proceedings. One of the surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen, later told investigators that she awoke during the early morning hours after hearing sounds she initially believed were consistent with one of her roommates playing with a dog. Later, she heard what sounded like crying. She also reported hearing a male voice say words similar to, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Concerned, she opened her bedroom door more than once. On the final occasion, she saw an unknown man, dressed in black clothing, walking past her toward the sliding glass door. She later described him as having bushy eyebrows, a detail that would become one of many pieces of information investigators used while reconstructing the crime. Importantly, investigators have never suggested that Dylan Mortensen understood the full nature of what had occurred in that moment. According to public records, she locked herself in her room after seeing the individual. Why she interpreted the situation as she did that night has been the subject of widespread speculation online, but much of that speculation has not been supported by evidence released in court. The other surviving roommate, Bethany Funke, was also inside the residence during the attack. Publicly released information about her observations has remained far more limited, and many details involving her were never fully explored in open court because the case concluded with a guilty plea before trial. As dawn approached, the attacker was gone. Inside the house, 4 students had suffered fatal knife wounds. No one outside the residence yet knew what had happened. Discovery. The morning of Sunday, November 13, 2022, began like any other weekend morning in a college town. Outside, students walked across campus, businesses opened their doors, and football fans prepared for another day of college sports. Inside 1122 King Road, however, something was terribly wrong. Public records show that neither surviving roommate immediately realized 4 murders had taken place inside the home during the early morning hours. Exactly what they believed had happened has never been fully established in public court proceedings, and many details remain sealed or were never presented because the case ended with a guilty plea. At some point later that morning, friends were contacted and came to the residence. Then, at 11:58 a.m., someone used one of the surviving roommates' phones to call 911. The dispatcher was told there was an unconscious person. That wording has often puzzled the public, but investigators have never suggested the caller knew the full scope of the scene before first responders arrived. Multiple people were present by then, and the exact sequence of observations leading to the call has never been completely reconstructed in public. When Moscow police officers entered the residence, they encountered one of the most complex homicide scenes in Idaho's recent history. Bryan Kohberger, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were all found dead from multiple stab wounds. There were no gunshots, no signs of forced entry, no obvious murder weapon left behind. The crime scene immediately raised a difficult question. How could someone enter a house occupied by 6 people, kill 4 of them, and disappear without being identified? The first 48 hours. The investigation expanded almost immediately. The Moscow Police Department was quickly joined by the Idaho State Police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Together, hundreds of investigators, analysts, forensic specialists, and support personnel would eventually contribute to the case. The house itself became the center of an enormous forensic operation. Every room was photographed. Every possible fingerprint was examined. Blood evidence, footwear impressions, digital devices, and trace materials were collected. Investigators also began canvassing nearby homes and businesses for surveillance footage. At first, authorities released very little information. They confirmed that 4 students had been killed with a knife, but declined to discuss many details publicly. That silence frustrated both the victims' families and members of the public. Rumors spread quickly across social media. Some internet users accused surviving roommates. Others focused on friends who had been seen with the victims hours earlier. Employees at the food truck where Kaylee and Madison had stopped received online harassment. Even the private driver who took the 2 women home became the subject of baseless speculation. Again and again, investigators publicly stated that individuals being targeted online were not considered suspects. The flood of misinformation became so overwhelming that police established a dedicated web page to correct false claims and provide verified updates. The investigation was only days old, yet the internet had already placed innocent people under an intense and unfair spotlight. It was an early reminder that public fascination with a case can sometimes complicate the search for the truth. Among the thousands of pieces of evidence collected inside the house, one item would become central to the investigation. On a bed near the victims, investigators recovered a tan leather knife sheath. The sheath bore the United States Marine Corps insignia and was designed to hold a Ka-bar-style fixed-blade knife, a type of combat knife originally developed during World War II and still widely available for civilian purchase. The knife itself was never recovered, but the sheath remained. During forensic examination, investigators discovered a single source of male DNA on the snap button of the sheath. At that moment, they did not know whose DNA it was. There was no immediate match in the National Criminal DNA Database. The sample, however, would later become one of the strongest pieces of physical evidence connecting the suspect to the crime. Years later, additional court filings revealed investigators had also examined purchase records indicating Bryan Kohberger had bought a Ka-bar-style knife and sheath months before the murders. Prosecutors intended to present that evidence at trial, although the guilty plea meant jurors never heard it in court. The combination of the sheath, DNA, and purchase history would eventually form a powerful narrative, but in November 2022, detectives were still searching for a name. While forensic scientists examined evidence inside the house, another investigative team focused on surveillance footage. Detectives collected video from homes, businesses, and traffic cameras across Moscow and neighboring communities. Hours of recordings were reviewed frame by frame. One vehicle kept appearing, a white Hyundai Elantra. According to investigators, the sedan was observed making multiple passes through the neighborhood during the early morning hours before the attack. Later footage showed what appeared to be the same vehicle leaving the area at a high rate of speed shortly after the estimated time of the murders. Initially, investigators believed the vehicle was a model produced between 2011 and 2013. As the investigation progressed, experts broadened that range after additional analysis. On December 7, 2022, nearly 4 weeks after the murders, police publicly announced they were searching for the occupants of a white Hyundai Elantra seen near the crime scene. The announcement generated thousands of tips from across the United States and Canada. Among those reviewing the bulletin were law enforcement officers at colleges and universities. one officer noticed something that would dramatically change the direction of the investigation. Bryan Kohberger. Less than 10 miles away, across the Idaho-Washington border, sits Washington State University in Pullman. There, a doctoral student named Bryan Kohberger was pursuing advanced studies in criminology. Kohberger had previously earned degrees in criminal justice and had shown a long-standing academic interest in criminal behavior. Investigators later learned he drove a white Hyundai Elantra. Campus police located a vehicle matching the description registered to Kohberger. From that moment, investigators began taking a much closer look. His driver's license photograph appeared generally consistent with the physical description provided by surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen, including notably bushy eyebrows. That observation alone was not enough to establish guilt, but it was one piece of a growing puzzle. Detectives then turned to digital evidence. Cell site records obtained through search warrants indicated Kohberger's phone had been in the vicinity of the King Road neighborhood on numerous occasions before the murders, according to investigators' interpretation of the data. Prosecutors argued these records suggested repeated visits to the area over several months. Defense attorneys later challenged aspects of the cell site analysis, arguing that location data cannot pinpoint a person's exact movements and should be interpreted cautiously. Those competing arguments were expected to be explored at trial, but because the case ended with a guilty plea, they were never tested before a jury. Investigators also concluded that Kohberger's phone stopped reporting to the cellular network during a critical period in the early morning hours of November 13, before reconnecting later. Prosecutors argued this pattern was consistent with an attempt to avoid leaving a digital trail. The defense had indicated it would dispute those conclusions. Again, those arguments were never heard in a trial. Still, investigators believed they were closing in on their suspect. What they needed next was something far more definitive. They needed to connect Bryan Kohberger to the DNA recovered from the knife sheath. By mid-December 2022, investigators had assembled several pieces of circumstantial evidence that appeared to point in the same direction. A white Hyundai Elantra, cell site records, surveillance footage, and a doctoral student in criminology whose movements were now under increasing scrutiny. But none of those elements, on their own, could place Bryan Kohberger inside the King Road house. The DNA recovered from the knife sheath remained the most promising lead. To identify its source, investigators turned to a method that has become increasingly important in modern criminal investigations: familial DNA comparison. As investigators monitored Kohberger after he traveled to his parents' home in Pennsylvania for the holidays, law enforcement conducted surveillance outside the residence. During that surveillance, agents recovered discarded trash that had been left for collection. A laboratory analyzed DNA from items found in that trash and compared it with the unknown male DNA profile recovered from the sheath. The result was not a direct match to Bryan Kohberger himself. Instead, the testing indicated that the DNA from the trash came from a male who could not be excluded as the biological father of the person whose DNA was found on the knife sheath. Investigators concluded that the sheath DNA was overwhelmingly likely to belong to one of that man's biological sons. Bryan Kohberger was one of them. That familial comparison gave investigators the probable cause they needed to move forward. After Kohberger was arrested, authorities collected a direct DNA sample from him pursuant to legal procedures. Subsequent testing matched his DNA profile to the DNA recovered from the knife sheath, according to prosecutors. The investigation had moved from suspicion to physical evidence. The Pennsylvania arrest. In the early hours of December 30th, 2022, tactical officers surrounded the Kohberger family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. The operation had been carefully planned. The FBI coordinated with Pennsylvania State Police and local authorities to execute the arrest, the rights he was giving up, and the consequences of pleading guilty. Kohberger answered the court's questions and confirmed that he wished to proceed. Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody without anyone being injured. At the same time, investigators executed search warrants at the residence and on his vehicle. The white Hyundai Elantra that investigators had spent weeks tracking was seized for forensic examination. Authorities also collected clothing, electronic devices, documents, and other items they believed might contain evidence. For many Americans who had followed the investigation for nearly 7 weeks, the arrest seemed to come almost out of nowhere. Behind the scenes, however, detectives had spent thousands of hours piecing together surveillance footage, digital records, forensic evidence, and witness statements. The arrest was only the beginning. The prosecution would still have to prove its case in court. As the case moved through the Idaho court system, prosecutors gradually disclosed more of the evidence they intended to present at trial. Some of it had already been described in the probable cause affidavit. Other details emerged later through court filings and hearings. Prosecutors argued that surveillance cameras documented a white Hyundai Elantra making repeated passes near the King Road residence before the attack, before leaving the area shortly afterward. Digital evidence suggested Kohberger's phone had traveled through parts of the surrounding region after the estimated time of the murders. Investigators also recovered electronic records showing the purchase of a K-bar-style knife and sheath months before the killings. Prosecutors intended to argue that those purchases were consistent with the sheath recovered beside one of the victims. The defense, however, made clear that it intended to challenge many aspects of the state's evidence. Defense attorneys questioned the interpretation of cell site location data. They argued that DNA evidence required careful scrutiny and that jurors should hear expert testimony about collection methods, transfer possibilities, and statistical interpretation. The defense also challenged certain search warrants and sought to exclude some evidence before trial. These disputes are common in major criminal cases. They do not necessarily indicate weakness by either side. Instead, they reflect the adversarial process through which courts determine what evidence jurors are allowed to consider. For nearly 3 years, both sides prepared for what many expected would become one of the most significant murder trials in Idaho history. Then, everything changed. By 2025, the case had experienced repeated delays. Jury selection had not yet begun, but the trial was approaching. Then prosecutors announced that Bryan Kohberger had agreed to plead guilty. Under the agreement, Kohberger admitted responsibility for the murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. He also waived several important rights, including the right to a jury trial and, with limited exceptions, the right to appeal many aspects of the conviction. Before accepting the plea, the judge conducted a detailed plea colloquy, a formal process designed to determine whether the defendant understands the agreement and is entering it knowingly, intelligently, and voluntarily. The judge questioned Kohberger extensively about his understanding of the charge. Because of that record, any later claim that the plea was involuntary would face a significant legal hurdle. The plea agreement immediately divided the victims' families. Some relatives supported the certainty of life imprisonment, believing it spared them years of additional appeals and uncertainty. Others strongly opposed the agreement. For them, a trial represented something more than determining guilt. It was an opportunity to hear every piece of evidence, understand the investigation in full, and perhaps learn why their loved ones had been targeted. The plea guaranteed punishment. It did not guarantee answers. On July 23, 2025, Bryan Kohberger returned to court for sentencing. Family members of the victims addressed the court in emotional victim impact statements. Some spoke directly to Kohberger. Others focused on the lives that had been taken rather than the man responsible. The hearing reflected 4 families coping with unimaginable loss, each expressing grief in deeply personal ways. After hearing those statements, the judge imposed 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. An additional sentence was imposed for burglary. Legally, the criminal case had reached its conclusion. Bryan Kohberger would spend the rest of his life in prison. There would be no death penalty trial, no jury, no public presentation of every witness, forensic expert, or investigative detail. Many of the questions that a trial might have answered remained unanswered. For nearly a year, that appeared to be the final chapter. Then came another legal filing that thrust the case back into the headlines. The case returns to court. For nearly a year after sentencing, the Idaho murders case appeared to be over. Bryan Kohberger had admitted guilt. He had been sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. The families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin had begun the difficult process of moving forward, knowing that no court proceeding could ever restore what they had lost. Then, in the summer of 2026, the case returned to the national spotlight. Kohberger filed a post-conviction petition seeking to challenge the guilty plea he had entered the previous year. Unlike a direct appeal, a post-conviction petition is a separate legal process. It does not ask whether a jury reached the correct verdict. Instead, it argues that a constitutional problem affected the conviction itself. Among the claims raised in Kohberger's filing were allegations that his guilty plea was not voluntary, that he received ineffective assistance of counsel, and that he was induced to plead guilty through improper pressure, threats, or promises. The filing also continued to maintain his claim of innocence despite the earlier guilty plea. These were serious allegations. But serious allegations are not the same as proven facts. To ensure the petition could be properly litigated, the court appointed new attorneys to represent Kohberger during the post-conviction proceedings. That appointment was a procedural step. It did not mean the court had accepted his arguments or concluded that any constitutional violation had occurred. As of August 2026, no judge has ruled that Kohberger's claims have merit. His convictions remain in place. His life sentences remain in effect. No new trial has been ordered. Some viewers may wonder why filing a petition does not automatically reopen the case. The answer lies in the difference between pre-sentencing and post-sentencing challenges. Before sentencing, courts generally have more flexibility to allow a defendant to withdraw a guilty plea under certain circumstances. After sentencing, however, the rules become much stricter. In Idaho, a defendant seeking to overturn a guilty plea after judgment typically must demonstrate a manifest injustice, a demanding legal standard designed to preserve the finality of criminal convictions. That means it is not enough to later regret accepting a plea bargain. A petitioner generally must show that a constitutional violation, such as ineffective legal representation or an involuntary plea, undermined the fairness of the proceedings. Courts often look closely at the transcript of the original plea hearing. In Kohberger's case, the judge carefully questioned him about the agreement, the rights he was waiving, and whether anyone had forced him to plead guilty. Those answers are now part of the official court record. For that reason, legal analysts have widely noted that overturning the plea would be difficult, though only the courts can ultimately decide the outcome. The petition remains pending. One consequence of the guilty plea is that the public never saw the evidence tested through a full trial. Many questions that attracted enormous attention remain unanswered. Perhaps the biggest is why. Investigators have never publicly identified a clear motive. They have also stated that they found no evidence of a prior personal relationship between Bryan Kohberger and the 4 victims. While various theories have circulated online, none has been established in court. Another unanswered question is whether one victim, or the house itself, was the primary target. Because there was no trial, prosecutors never presented a complete narrative explaining how investigators believed the attack unfolded inside the residence. The exact order of events remains uncertain in the public record. Some investigative materials remain sealed. Other evidence may never become public at all. That uncertainty has fueled years of speculation. But speculation is not evidence. One of the most important lessons from this case is that the absence of information often creates space for rumors to grow. During the investigation, countless innocent people were accused online without evidence. Friends of the victims, neighbors, classmates, the surviving roommates, even individuals who had simply crossed paths with the victims in public. Many of those accusations spread rapidly across social media before investigators publicly ruled those individuals out. For the people falsely accused, the damage was real. The Idaho murders became a reminder that internet investigations can sometimes cause harm instead of helping uncover the truth. While many questions remain unanswered, the investigation itself demonstrated how modern policing has evolved. There was no eyewitness who identified the suspect. No confession during the investigation. No murder weapon recovered. Instead, detectives built their case by combining dozens of different forms of evidence. Surveillance cameras captured vehicle movements across multiple communities. Digital records helped investigators reconstruct timelines. Cell site data suggested patterns of travel that investigators believed were significant, though the defense intended to challenge those interpretations. DNA recovered from the knife sheath became a critical forensic lead. Investigators also used familial DNA comparison to narrow the search before obtaining a direct DNA sample from Kohberger after his arrest. None of those pieces alone necessarily solved the case. Together, prosecutors argued, they formed a compelling chain of evidence. The investigation also highlighted both the strengths and limitations of modern forensic technology. Cell site data can indicate where a phone may have been, but it cannot pinpoint every movement with perfect precision. DNA is powerful evidence, but it must be carefully collected, analyzed, and interpreted. Surveillance footage can establish timelines, yet it rarely tells the entire story. Modern criminal investigations increasingly rely on combining many independent sources of evidence, rather than a single decisive clue. Nearly 4 years after the murders, the impact of the case is still felt. For the families, there is no legal outcome capable of erasing the loss of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Their names continue to be remembered not because of how they died, but because of the lives they lived. Students, friends, siblings, daughters, and a son whose futures ended far too soon. The house at 1122 King Road no longer stands. It was demolished in December 2023 after lengthy discussions involving the University of Idaho and the victims' families. Officials said the goal was to remove what had become an unwanted focal point for curiosity and tourism, allowing the community to continue healing. Yet the demolition of the building did not erase the questions that remain. Why that house? Why those victims? What was happening inside the attacker's mind? Those answers may exist somewhere within sealed investigative files, or they may never be fully known. Unless new evidence emerges through future court proceedings, some parts of the story could remain unanswered forever. Idaho murders changed a university, a community, and the lives of countless families forever. The investigation showcased the remarkable capabilities of modern forensic science and painstaking detective work. At the same time, it exposed the dangers of online speculation, the emotional cost of prolonged legal proceedings, and the reality that even a guilty plea does not always provide complete answers. Today, Bryan Kohberger remains convicted and imprisoned under 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. His 2026 post-conviction petition is still pending. Whether the courts ultimately reject or entertain his claims, one fact has not changed. 4 young people lost their lives on a November night in 2022. Nothing that happens in a courtroom can change that. If this case has taught us anything, it is that justice is not always the same as closure. Sometimes, the legal process reaches its end, while the search for understanding continues. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative and appreciate fact-based, carefully researched true crime coverage, consider subscribing. New documentaries are released regularly, focusing on the evidence, the investigation, and the stories behind some of the world's most significant criminal cases.